When I say I'm terrified, I mean the kind of fear that keeps you awake at night, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything you thought you knew about the people around you. It started 5 years ago, on a cold autumn evening, when Charles, my next-door neighbor, a man I had known for nearly a decade, knocked on my door. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he spoke. "My son, he's gone." Those words hung heavy in the crisp evening air. His 14-year-old son, Ryan, had vanished without a trace. One minute he was skateboarding in front of their house. The next he was just gone. The police were called. Search parties formed. Helicopters buzzed overhead for days. His photo flashed on every news station in the city. My wife and I offered every bit of help we could, handing out flyers, volunteering in the searches. We watched, powerless, as Charles and his wife Kathy crumbled under the weight of their grief. Weeks turned into months. Months blurred into years. No word, no ransom note, no body. Eventually, life in the neighborhood found its numb rhythm again, but something about the house next door remained frozen. Silent. Charles and Kathy were never quite the same. Barbecues in the summer became quieter affairs. Kathy, once full of life, barely spoke above a whisper. Charles, always an easygoing man, had a permanent look of unease etched into his features. His hands shook when he passed me a plate of burgers, his eyes darting around as if he were expecting something or someone. And honestly, who could blame them? No one wanted to be the monster to ask the forbidden question, did they ever find him? So we never did. We just lived. Or tried to. Fast forward to just last week. It was a Wednesday night. The sun was setting, staining the sky with streaks of purple and crimson. I was taking out the trash when I saw Charles standing at the edge of his driveway, wringing his hands nervously. "Hey," he called out, his voice cracking mid-word. "Could I borrow your shovel?" Without a second thought, I smiled and told him I'd grab it. Charles was a good man, or so I thought. I dashed into my garage, picked the sturdiest shovel I had, and handed it over the fence. He nodded stiffly, muttered something like, "Just need to do some work in the backyard," and disappeared behind his house. At first, I didn't think much of it. People dig in their yards all the time, right? Maybe he was planting a tree, or fixing a broken pipe. But something gnawed at me. Some tiny, primal voice in the back of my mind whispered, "Watch him." So I did. From my upstairs bedroom window, I had a clear view into his backyard. And what I saw sent a cold ripple through my spine. Charles was digging. Not a small hole. A massive one. Deep enough that he had to climb into it to keep digging further. His movements were frantic. Like he was racing against time. And he wasn't wearing yard work clothes either. He was dressed in all black, long sleeves, long pants, even though the evening was still warm. I watched for several minutes, the anxiety in my chest tightening with every shovelful of dirt he tossed aside. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my second shovel and decided to offer help. I stepped into his backyard, clearing my throat loudly to announce myself. "Charles, need a hand?" He jerked up so fast he almost lost his balance. His face was wrong somehow. Mouth slightly open like he wanted to scream but couldn't. Dropping my shovel, he hurried over to me, waving his hands frantically. "No. I've got it. Please. Just go." His voice cracked again, and he glanced nervously over his shoulder at the half-dug hole behind him. I laughed awkwardly. "Come on, man, it's no big deal. You look like you could use..." "And he barked, cutting me off, his voice booming in the otherwise still backyard. "I won't allow you to use that shovel in my backyard." He pointed at the gate, like I was some stray dog to be shooed away. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I felt a strange, buzzing tension in the air. Something was horribly, horribly wrong. Without saying another word, I backed out through the gate, feeling his eyes burning into my back. Once inside my house, I ran upstairs, heart hammering, and peered out the window again. Charles was digging faster now. desperately. Every so often, he would stop and glance around at the neighboring houses, scanning the windows and rooftops. And then, he spotted me. For one horrifying second, our eyes locked. I froze. He froze. Then, trying to play it off, I casually stepped away from the window, my mind racing. What the hell was he burying? Or worse, what was he unburying? That night, I barely slept. At 1:30 a.m., I was jolted awake by a faint, rhythmic sound. Plink, thunk, plink, thunk. The sound of a shovel hitting dirt. I crept to the window again. But it was too dark to see anything clearly. Heart pounding, I slipped downstairs, out the back door, and into the shadows of my backyard. I peeked over the fence just in time to see Charles, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, kneeling beside the hole, pulling something heavy wrapped in black plastic from the dirt. My stomach turned. A black garbage bag, lumpy, protruding from the soil like some grotesque tumor. He struggled with it for a moment, then disappeared into his garage. That was my chance. Adrenaline overriding every ounce of common sense, I climbed the fence and dropped into his backyard. The smell hit me first, faint but unmistakable. The sour, metallic stench of rot. I inched closer to the hole. The bag, it was tied tightly at the ends, but part of it had ripped open during the digging. And what I saw inside, I staggered back, slapping a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. I'm not proud to admit it, but I ran. I vaulted the fence, sprinted across my backyard, and locked every door and window in the house. The next morning, the hole was gone. Paved over. The grass replaced. Perfect. Like nothing had ever happened. Charles's SUV, which had always been parked neatly in his driveway, was now sitting in the street. He never returned my shovel, and he hasn't looked me in the eye since. But yesterday, when I glanced casually out my window, just as the afternoon sun was setting, I saw him, Charles, standing at his upstairs window, staring directly into mine, not moving, not blinking, just watching. When he realized I noticed, he pulled the blinds down in one swift, violent motion. And now, I don't know what to do, because whatever Charles buried or unburied in that backyard, I'm certain now, it wasn't just trash. It's strange how silence can be louder than any scream. The next few days after that night were a blur. I avoided Charles. He avoided me. The normal rhythms of the neighborhood, the distant lawnmower hums, kids riding bikes, dogs barking, felt unnatural now, like some sinister play was being performed around me, and I was the only one who knew the script was rotten underneath. I thought about telling someone, my wife, the police, anyone. But every time I opened my mouth to speak, I remembered Charles's face at that window. Emotionless, unblinking, watching, and something deep inside me whispered, if you speak, he'll know. That Saturday, I decided to act normal. I mowed the lawn, waved half-heartedly at the mailman, even made small talk with old Mrs. Peterson across the street. All the while, I could feel the weight of Charles's unseen gaze pressing against my back. It wasn't paranoia. Twice, when I turned suddenly, I caught movement. His blinds shifting slightly, a shadow stepping back from the window. I was being watched. Constantly. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees outside made my skin crawl. At 2 a.m., lying rigid in bed, I heard it. A knock. So, measured. At my back door. My wife stirred beside me but didn't wake up. Holding my breath, I slid out of bed and crept to the kitchen. The knocking came again. Softer this time. Almost like a whisper against the wood. I peeked through the curtains. Nobody there. Only the faint outline of my backyard under the pale wash of the moon. And then I saw it. In the dirt near the fence, something glinted. Curiosity, fear, and pure adrenaline propelled me out the door before my brain could protest. I ran across the yard and picked it up. It was my shovel. The one Charles had borrowed. It was clean. Too clean. The metal gleamed under the moonlight, as if it had been scrubbed meticulously. And tied around the handle with a filthy, frayed piece of twine was a scrap of black garbage bag. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room, holding the shovel across my lap like a weapon, staring at the front door. Morning couldn't come fast enough. By sunrise, I made a decision. I needed answers. Real answers. And if I had to get them myself, so be it. At noon, I knocked on Charles's door. 3 short raps, my heart hammering against my ribs with each one. For a long time, there was nothing. No footsteps. No movement inside. Then finally, the door creaked open a few inches. Charles stood there, his face gaunt and hollow, eyes bloodshot. He looked broken. "Can I help you?" he rasped. I opened my mouth, unsure of what I was even planning to say. But before I could find the words, I noticed something. Just behind him, inside the darkened house. A pair of muddy boots. Tiny boots. Children's size. Sitting neatly beside the door. It didn't make sense. Charles and Kathy didn't have any other kids. They never had. My skin prickled. I just wanted to check if you needed anything, I stammered. Charles blinked slowly, studying me with an unreadable expression. Finally, he smiled. A hollow, empty thing that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he whispered. "But thanks." And with that, he gently closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoed in my ears. I backed away, heart thudding, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. When I turned to leave, I saw Kathy standing at the upstairs window, half hidden behind the curtain. She wasn't looking at me though. She was staring at the front door. Charles. And the look on her face. Pure terror. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to call the police anonymously. I figured I'd report suspicious activity, just enough to trigger a welfare check, nothing more. I wasn't accusing anyone. I just needed to know someone else would look. I dialed the number, hands trembling, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the ringing. And then, just as the dispatcher answered, I lost my nerve. I hung up. I sat there, phone in my lap, feeling like a coward. But something deep inside warned me. If Charles found out I had called the police, it wouldn't end well. At around 3 a.m., I heard something again. But this time, it wasn't a knock. It was a scratching, a slow, deliberate scraping sound against the side of my house. I crept to the window and peeked out through a slit in the curtain. I almost screamed. There, standing inches from the glass, was Charles. His face pressed against the window, grinning, his teeth gleaming in the moonlight, his eyes wide and unblinking. And in his hand, he was holding something. Something dark, something limp. At first, I thought it was a garbage bag, but as he lifted it slowly, almost proudly, I realized it was a tattered old backpack. A kid's backpack, faded blue, with a single patch stitched onto it. Ryan's first grade graduation, class of 2014. I stumbled back from the window, heart hammering against my ribs, gasping for breath. By the time I summoned the courage to look again, Charles was gone. Only the faint outline of footprints remained in the dew-soaked grass outside. And hanging from my front door handle was the backpack, swinging gently in the breeze. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Charles's face, pressed against my window, grinning like a lunatic, and that tiny, battered backpack swinging from my door handle like some sick trophy. I kept the doors locked, the curtains drawn, the lights off. I sat in the darkness, clutching a baseball bat, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Dawn came slowly, bleeding gray light into the sky, but it didn't bring any comfort, only dread, and the haunting realization that whatever Charles was hiding, it wasn't buried anymore. It was loose. When my wife woke up, I lied. I told her I was feeling sick, that I needed to stay home from work. There was no way I could leave her alone. Not after what I saw. Not with him still next door. She didn't question it. just gave me a concerned look and went about her morning routine. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see Charles watching me again. But his blinds remained shut, the house eerily still. Too still. By noon, I made a decision. I had to know. I couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in fear, questioning my own sanity. I needed to see what was in that house. So when my wife left to run some errands, I waited. Waited until the street was empty. Waited until the silence felt suffocating. Then, heart-hammering, I crept across the lawn. Charles's front door was locked, of course. But around back, near the garden shed, I found a window that was cracked open slightly. Barely enough space for a hand, but maybe enough for a desperate man. I wedged it open further, wincing at the faint squeal of the old metal frame. I hesitated for a long moment, every rational part of my brain screaming at me to turn back. But then I thought of Ryan, that missing boy, the backpack, and I climbed through. The inside of Charles's house was like stepping into a tomb. Dust hung heavy in the air. The curtains were drawn tight, casting everything in a sickly half-light. The air smelled damp and something else. Something metallic. Rotting. I moved quietly, listening for any sign of movement. The living room was empty. The kitchen too. Photos lined the walls. Family photos. Smiling faces frozen in happier times. Ryan's face stared back at me from a dozen frames, a permanent reminder of the boy who never came home. I was about to leave, about to accept that I was crazy, when I heard it, a faint scratching sound, coming from downstairs. The basement, of course. Well, I found the door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness yawning behind it. The scratching grew louder as I approached. So rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I pushed the door open anyway. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. Halfway down I froze, because I could see it now. At the bottom of the stairs, illuminated by a single swinging bulb, a figure, thin, hunched in the corner of the basement, scratching at the floor with broken, bloodied fingers. It was a boy, or what was left of one. His clothes were torn and filthy, his skin pale and sickly, hair matted to his scalp. He was whispering something under his breath, over and over again, in a voice so soft I had to strain to hear it. Let me go, let me go, let me go. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the boy slowly turned his head to look at me, and my blood turned to ice. Because it was Ryan, the missing boy. His eyes were wide and hollow, pupils dilated until they looked like black pits. And around his neck, cutting deep into his flesh, was a thick leather collar. Chained to the wall behind him, I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My foot hit something hard. I looked down and saw bones. Tiny bones. Animal bones, maybe. Or worse. The realization hit me like a freight train. Ryan hadn't been kidnapped by some stranger. He hadn't wandered off and gotten lost. He had been here the whole time. Buried. Hidden. In plain sight. Prisoner in his own home. Before I could even react, I heard heavy footsteps above me. The floorboards groaned under the weight. Charles. He was home. And he knew. I heard the basement door slam shut. A key turning in the lock. Trapping me inside. I bolted up the stairs, slamming my fists against the door. Let me out. Charles, open the door. No answer. Only the sound of him walking away, slow and deliberate. And then laughter. Low, guttural laughter, trailing off into the house. I turned back to Ryan, who was still staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. I had to think. I found a rusted old crowbar leaning against the wall and rushed to the chain around his neck. It took everything I had, but finally the chain snapped free. Ryan collapsed into my arms, weak and trembling. I didn't have time to comfort him. I hoisted him up and searched the basement for another exit. A small window high on the far wall. Barely big enough for a child. or a desperate man. I smashed it open with the crowbar, ignoring the glass slicing into my hands. I pushed Ryan through first, helping him crawl out into the backyard. Then I followed, squeezing through the jagged frame, feeling the glass tear at my clothes and skin. We stumbled into the sunlight, gasping for air like drowning men. And standing in the middle of the yard, waiting for us, was Charles, smiling, a hammer dangling loosely from one hand. "Where do you think you're going?" he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. Ryan whimpered beside me, clutching my arm. I backed away slowly, keeping my body between him and Charles. And then, mercifully, I heard sirens, dozens of them, red and blue lights flashing at the end of the street. Neighbors pouring out of their houses, pointing, shouting. Someone must have seen. Someone must have called. Charles's smile faltered. He dropped the hammer, raised his hands slowly, and for the first time, I saw something real in his eyes. Not anger, not fear, but relief, as if he'd been waiting to get caught. The police tackled him to the ground. They pulled me and Ryan aside, wrapping us in blankets, asking 1,000 questions I could barely comprehend. Ryan was rushed to the hospital. Charles was taken away in handcuffs. And me? I just stood there, in the middle of the street, staring at the house that had hidden a nightmare for 5 long years. It's been 2 months now. Ryan's alive, but the doctors say he may never fully recover from the trauma. I still wake up some nights, gasping for air, the smell of that basement clinging to my skin. We moved away, of course, sold the house, left it all behind. But sometimes, when the night is quiet, when the wind rattles the windows just right, I swear I can still hear it, the soft, desperate whisper. Let me go, let me go, let me go. You don't realize how dangerous people can be until you're standing face to face with them and it's already too late. It happened when I was 15. We had been living in our first house for almost my entire life. A small, 2-story place on a sleepy suburban street, surrounded by identical houses and neatly trimmed lawns. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. If anything, it was boring, quiet. Maybe that's why nobody thought twice about the strange boys next door. There were 2 of them, Eric and Todd. They lived with their father, a grim-faced man who rarely left the house and almost never spoke to anyone. My parents didn't interact with them. Neither did my brother or I. In fact, in the 15 years we lived there, I think we exchanged less than a handful of words. It wasn't like we hated them. It was more like an unspoken understanding. Stay on your side, and we'll stay on ours. Simple. Until the day that line was crossed. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sun baked the sidewalks and the sound of sprinklers filled the air. My little brother and I were outside playing basketball in the driveway, sweating under the heavy summer heat, laughing, shoving each other around like brothers do. That's when Todd appeared. I remember it clearly. He came strolling across his yard like it was the most natural thing in the world, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face wearing a strange, unreadable expression. He was about my age, maybe a little older. I tensed immediately, not because he looked threatening, but because he never came over. None of them did. He stopped at the edge of our driveway and smiled, a thin, humorless smile. "Hey," he said casually, "is it true you guys are moving?" I wiped sweat from my forehead and shrugged. "Yeah, end of the summer." He nodded slowly, kicking at a crack in the pavement with his sneaker. "Cool," he said. "Me and my brother, we're heading down to the river tomorrow. Shooting BB guns. You wanna come?" For a second, I didn't know how to answer. I glanced at my little brother, who was already looking up at me with wide, eager eyes. I didn't really want to go. There was something about Todd, the way he spoke, the way he looked at you, that made my skin itch. But saying no felt wrong somehow. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. "Sure," I heard myself say. "Sounds fun." Todd smiled again. A little wider this time. A little too wide. "Cool," he said. "Tomorrow. Meet us at the corner after lunch." And without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing behind the worn wooden fence. That night at dinner, my brother couldn't stop talking about it. He babbled on about BB guns, how cool it would be to shoot cans by the river, how maybe we could even get our own someday. I smiled and nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling growing in my gut. Something about Todd's invitation didn't feel right. But I said nothing. After all, what was the worst that could happen? The next day, we met them as promised. Todd and Eric were already waiting at the corner, dressed head to toe in camouflage gear like they were about to head into battle. Eric, a year or two younger than Todd but somehow meaner looking, carried a heavy duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Neither of them said much as we fell into step behind them, heading toward the woods that bordered our neighborhood. It was awkward, uncomfortable. Every few minutes, I'd catch my brother glancing at me, eyebrows raised, as if to say, "This is weird, right?" I just nodded. It was weird. The woods were dense and overgrown, a maze of tangled trees and thorny bushes. We followed a narrow dirt path that wound down toward the river, the sunlight barely filtering through the canopy above. It was beautiful in a way. Quiet. Too quiet. Finally, after what felt like an hour, Todd stopped in a small clearing near the riverbank. He dropped the duffel bag onto the ground with a heavy thud. Eric yanked the zipper open. Inside, instead of BB guns, were real guns. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. A sick, twisted joke. But then Eric pulled out a revolver, cocked the hammer back, and fired a shot into the trees across the river. The crack of the gunshot split the air like a lightning strike. Birds erupted from the branches above us, screeching in terror. My brother jumped nearly a foot in the air. I felt my heart plummet into my stomach. This wasn't a game. This wasn't fun. This was something else entirely. I grabbed the BB gun Todd was trying to hand to my brother and shoved it back into the bag. "We're leaving," I said, my voice low and steady. Todd's smile faded. Eric lowered the revolver slowly, tilting his head like he was studying an insect under a microscope. "You scared?" Eric sneered. I didn't answer. I just grabbed my brother's arm and turned away. We walked back the way we came, not running, not looking back, even though every instinct screamed at me to move faster. I didn't trust them. I didn't trust what they might do if they thought we were afraid. As we walked, I heard it behind us. Eric's laughter. Mocking. Then Todd's voice, drifting through the trees like smoke. "Little babies. Run back to mommy." I ignored them, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, focused on getting home, focused on not thinking about the gunshots still ringing in my ears. That night at dinner, I wanted to tell my parents. I really did. But how do you explain something like that? "Hey Mom, Dad, Todd and Eric next door have real guns and tried to get us to play with them." It sounded crazy even in my head. And there was the unspoken rule of teenage boys. Don't snitch. Instead, I just told them Todd and Eric were weird. My parents exchanged a glance and shrugged. We were moving soon anyway. It didn't matter. We could survive a few more weeks, right? I fell asleep quickly that night, exhausted from the fear and adrenaline, but it didn't last long. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sensation, cold air brushing against my face. My window, which I was sure I had locked, was wide open, and there was something pressed against the back of my head. Something hard, metallic. I froze, too afraid to breathe, too afraid to move. And then a voice, a low, venomous whisper, inches from my ear. "Don't say a word. Don't tell anyone." I stayed completely still, not daring to even breathe. The cold press of the metal against the back of my head was unmistakable. It was a gun. And the voice behind me, raspy, low, and filled with venom, was Todd's. "You say anything," he whispered, his breath hot and sour against my ear, "and I'll kill you. I'll kill your whole family." I wanted to scream, wanted to jump out of the bed, to fight, to run. But somehow, some survival instinct deeper than thought told me, stay calm, stay quiet, stay alive. My voice barely worked, but I managed a shaky whisper. Okay, I won't tell. There was a pause. So long I thought he might pull the trigger anyway. Then the pressure lifted. I heard the soft rustle of movement, the faint creak of the window. By the time I dared to turn around, he was gone. The window swung lightly in the night breeze. And outside, across the yard, I saw two shadowy figures retreating into the darkness. Eric and Todd. I locked the window, bolted it, pushed my desk against it for good measure. Then I sat on my bed for the rest of the night, knees pulled to my chest, listening to every sound the house made, terrified they would come back. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. In the morning, everything felt wrong. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, but it all felt fake, like a stage set hiding something rotten underneath. I didn't tell my parents what happened. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But every time I tried, I remembered the cold press of that gun against my skull. The voice, whispering death into my ear. And I stayed silent. The next few days passed in a weird, tense haze. I barely left the house. My brother didn't understand why. He kept asking why we weren't riding bikes, playing basketball, hanging out like normal. I just made excuses. I told him I wasn't feeling well, that I had too much homework, anything to keep him close, anything to keep him safe. But Todd and Eric weren't done. Not by a long shot. It started small. At night, when I looked across the street, I would see them, standing at their window, barely visible behind the curtains, staring into my room. Watching. They never moved. Never blinked. Just stared. Sometimes for minutes. Sometimes for hours. It became a sick game. Who would look away first? One night, just before midnight, I heard the soft ping of something hitting my window. I jerked awake, heart hammering. Another ping. Another. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Down on the front lawn, half hidden by the bushes, Todd stood with a handful of rocks. He grinned when he saw me, raised his hand, pointed his finger at me, mimicked pulling a trigger. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. I barely slept after that. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to shut down. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every shadow made me flinch. I kept imagining them breaking in, imagining the cold metal against my head again, imagining my family, asleep and helpless, not even knowing the danger that lurked right next door. The worst part? No one else saw it. To my parents, to the neighbors, Eric and Todd were just weird kids. Nothing more. If I told anyone, they'd laugh it off. Boys being boys. They're just troubled. No one would believe how dangerous they really were. And they knew it. That's why they were so bold. That's why they weren't afraid. The final straw came a week before we moved. I had just managed to drift into a restless sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My window. Someone had thrown something at it. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and threw the curtains open. And there he was, Todd, standing in the street, holding something small and black, pointing it at me. For one horrifying moment, I thought it was a gun. I dove to the floor, heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. But no shot came. Instead, I heard laughter. Harsh. True. When I peeked up over the windowsill, I saw Todd and Eric doubled over, clutching their sides, mocking me, humiliating me, playing with me like a cat with a wounded mouse. The next day, the rock was still lying on the front lawn. No gun, just a rock. It had been a trick, a sick, twisted game to watch me panic. And it had worked. There were 2 more incidents that week, both worse than the last. Once, I caught them leaving something on our porch, a dead squirrel, its neck twisted unnaturally. Another time, I found crude messages carved into the sidewalk in front of our house. Squeal and you die. Watch your back. I told my parents we needed to move early. They thought it was because I was excited about the new house. They didn't know the real reason. They didn't know the nightmare unfolding right under their noses. The day we finally left, I didn't look back. Not once. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wave. I climbed into the car, locked the door, and kept my head down as we pulled away from that cursed street. And even now, years later, I sometimes wonder what happened to them. Todd and Eric. Where they went. What they became. If they ever hurt someone for real. If they ever made good on their whispered threats. One thing's for sure. I never forgot their faces. Or the feel of that cold metal against my head. Or the sound of their laughter as they disappeared into the night. And I never will. Moving out on your own sounds exciting when you're fresh out of college. No parents, no curfews, just freedom. I thought that too. Until I realized freedom sometimes comes with a different kind of prison. One you can't just walk away from. I had scraped together enough money to rent a small, beat-up house in a part of town most people preferred to avoid. The place wasn't much, a tiny front yard filled with weeds, a creaky front porch, and pipes that sounded like a dying cat whenever I turned on the hot water. But it was mine. And after years of cramped dorm rooms and roommates who stole my food, I was ready to have my own space. Even if that space came with questionable neighbors. On one side of my house lived a family that loved music. Loved it. Rock, rap, country, it didn't matter. It blasted at full volume at all hours, rattling my walls and fraying my nerves. But it wasn't the loud music that scared me. It was the house on the other side. The house that felt wrong. There were two women living there. An older woman, maybe in her 60s, with a pinched face and sharp eyes that seemed to slice right through you. And a younger woman, maybe in her late 30s, who had some kind of severe mental disorder. I never figured out exactly what it was. All I knew was that the younger woman would sometimes stand in the front yard for hours, rocking back and forth, muttering to herself, pointing at invisible things. Sometimes she screamed. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she stared at me, right into me. The older woman, who I assumed was either her mother or caretaker, wasn't much better. She would drag the younger woman inside during these episodes, cursing under her breath, shooting me looks that made my skin crawl. They didn't talk to anyone. They didn't wave. They just watched. Always watched. At first, I told myself it was none of my business. People have struggles. People are different. It wasn't my place to judge. But as the weeks went by, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Something wasn't right in that house. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before that wrongness spilled over into mine. The first real incident happened late one night. I had an early shift the next morning, so I went to bed around 10 p.m., hoping to get at least a few hours of peace before the neighbors started blasting AC/DC again. But around midnight, I woke to the sound of screaming. High-pitched, guttural, animalistic. It was coming from next door. I sat up, heart hammering, listening. Thuds. Crashes. The sound of glass shattering. And above it all, the younger woman's voice shrieking incomprehensible words. Words that didn't even sound human. At first, I pulled the covers tighter and told myself it wasn't my problem. Not my circus. Not my monkeys. But as the minutes dragged on and the chaos only grew louder, I realized I couldn't just ignore it. Someone could be getting hurt. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my phone, and marched next door. My hands were shaking as I knocked on their front door, the sounds of violence thudding through the thin walls. After a few seconds, the door yanked open so violently I flinched. The older woman stood there, her face twisted with anger. "What the hell do you want?" she barked. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Sorry, could you keep it down? It's really loud." For a moment, she just stared at me. No expression. No response. Then, from deeper inside the house, I heard it. "How dare you!" The younger woman barreled into view, eyes wild, hair flying in every direction. She lunged forward, arms flailing. The older woman grabbed her just in time, holding her back with surprising strength. Without another word, the older woman slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a second, stunned. Then turned and walked back to my house, heart pounding. But at least, it was quiet now. silent even. Almost too silent. Still, I crawled back into bed, relieved to finally have peace. That peace lasted all of 2 hours. At around 3 a.m., I woke again. This time, it wasn't screaming. It was something else. Something worse. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. At first, nothing. A soft, almost rhythmic creaking sound. From downstairs. I told myself it was the house settling. Old pipes. The usual excuses. But deep down I knew I wasn't alone. I reached for my phone, fumbling blindly in the dark, and turned on the screen for a tiny bit of light. I didn't dare turn on the bedroom lamp. Some part of me instinctively knew. Don't make it obvious you're awake. I tiptoed to the door and pressed my ear against it. Another soft creak. Closer this time. Something, or someone, was moving through my house. I took a deep breath, opened the door just a crack, and peered out. The hallway was empty, but downstairs, I saw it. A shadow. A dark, hunched figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. Waiting. I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart thundering against my ribs. I backed away, my mind racing. What do? Call the police? Scream? Before I could decide, I heard it. Soft footsteps, coming up the stairs. Slow. Deliberate. One step. Fuzz. Another step. Fuzz. Closer and closer. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, and stood behind the door, clutching it like a weapon. The footsteps stopped just outside my room. The doorknob jiggled softly. Twice. Then silence. For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen, listening. No movement. No sound. Finally, after what must have been 10 minutes, I heard it. The soft, creaky sound of footsteps retreating down the stairs. The front door opening. Closing. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking. Whoever it was, they were gone. For now. In the morning, I checked the locks. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut. No signs of forced entry. No signs anyone had ever been there. Except for one thing. On the living room floor, in the center of the carpet, a single muddy footprint. Leading toward the stairs. Moving out on your own sounds exciting when you're fresh out of college. No parents, no curfews, just freedom. I thought that too. Until I realized freedom sometimes comes with a different kind of prison. One you can't just walk away from. I had scraped together enough money to rent a small, beat-up house in a part of town most people preferred to avoid. The place wasn't much, a tiny front yard filled with weeds, a creaky front porch, and pipes that sounded like a dying cat whenever I turned on the hot water. But it was mine. And after years of cramped dorm rooms and roommates who stole my food, I was ready to have my own space. Even if that space came with questionable neighbors. On one side of my house lived a family that loved music. Loved it. Rock, rap, country, it didn't matter. It blasted at full volume at all hours, rattling my walls and fraying my nerves. But it wasn't the loud music that scared me. It was the house on the other side. The house that felt wrong. There were 2 women living there. An older woman, maybe in her 60s, with a pinched face and sharp eyes that seemed to slice right through you. And a younger woman, maybe in her late 30s, who had some kind of severe mental disorder. I never figured out exactly what it was. All I knew was that the younger woman would sometimes stand in the front yard for hours, rocking back and forth, muttering to herself, pointing at invisible things. Sometimes she screamed. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she stared. At me. Right into me. The older woman, who I assumed was either her mother or caretaker, wasn't much better. She would drag the younger woman inside during these episodes, cursing under her breath, shooting me looks that made my skin crawl. They didn't talk to anyone. They didn't wave. They just watched. Always watched. At first, I told myself it was none of my business. People have struggles. People are different. It wasn't my place to judge. But as the weeks went by, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Something wasn't right in that house. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before that wrongness spilled over into mine. The first real incident happened late one night. I had an early shift the next morning, so I went to bed around 10 p.m., hoping to get at least a few hours of peace before the neighbors started blasting AC/DC again. But around midnight, I woke to the sound of screaming. High-pitched, guttural, animalistic. It was coming from next door. I sat up, heart hammering, listening. Thuds. Crashes. The sound of glass shattering. And above it all, the younger woman's voice shrieking incomprehensible words. Words that didn't even sound human. At first, I pulled the covers tighter and told myself it wasn't my problem. Not my circus. Not my monkeys. But as the minutes dragged on and the chaos only grew louder, I realized I couldn't just ignore it. Someone could be getting hurt. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my phone, and marched next door. My hands were shaking as I knocked on their front door, the sounds of violence thudding through the thin walls. After a few seconds, the door yanked open so violently I flinched. The older woman stood there, her face twisted with anger. "What the hell do you want?" she barked. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Sorry, could you keep it down? It's really loud." For a moment, she just stared at me. No expression. No response. Then, from deeper inside the house, I heard it. "How dare you!" The younger woman barreled into view, eyes wild, hair flying in every direction. She lunged forward, arms flailing. The older woman grabbed her just in time, holding her back with surprising strength. Without another word, the older woman slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a second, stunned. Then turned and walked back to my house, heart pounding. But at least, it was quiet now. Silent even. Almost too silent. Still, I crawled back into bed, relieved to finally have peace. That peace lasted all of 2 hours. At around 3 a.m., I woke again. This time, it wasn't screaming. It was something else. Something worse. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. At first, nothing. A soft, almost rhythmic creaking sound. From downstairs. I told myself it was the house settling. Old pipes. The usual excuses. But deep down I knew I wasn't alone. I reached for my phone, fumbling blindly in the dark, and turned on the screen for a tiny bit of light. I didn't dare turn on the bedroom lamp. Some part of me instinctively knew. Don't make it obvious you're awake. I tiptoed to the door and pressed my ear against it. Another soft creak. Closer this time. Something, or someone, was moving through my house. I took a deep breath, opened the door just a crack, and peered out. The hallway was empty. But downstairs, I saw it. A shadow. A dark, hunched figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. Waiting. I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart thundering against my ribs. I backed away, my mind racing. What do I do? Call the police? Scream? Before I could decide, I heard it. Soft footsteps, coming up the stairs. Slow. Deliberate. One step. Fuzz. Another step. Fuzz. Closer and closer. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, and stood behind the door, clutching it like a weapon. The footsteps stopped just outside my room. The doorknob jiggled softly. Twice. Then silence. For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen, listening. No movement. No sound. Finally, after what must have been 10 minutes, I heard it. The soft, creaky sound of footsteps retreating down the stairs. The front door opening. Closing. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking. Whoever it was, they were gone. For now. In the morning, I checked the locks. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut. No signs of forced entry. No signs anyone had ever been there. Except for one thing. On the living room floor, in the center of the carpet, a single muddy footprint. Leading toward the stairs. I couldn't stop staring at that muddy footprint. pointed directly toward the stairs, toward me. There was no logical explanation. The doors had been locked, the windows shut. I should have been safe. But somehow, she had gotten inside. I spent that day in a fog, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside. I didn't dare leave the house, didn't dare open the curtains. I felt exposed, hunted. I double-checked the locks, triple-checked. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. Locks wouldn't stop her. Not if she really wanted to come back. That night, I barricaded the front door with furniture. I dragged the sofa across it, stacked chairs against the windows. My heart pounded the whole time. I knew how it would look to anyone else, like I was losing my mind. But I didn't care, because I had seen her. I had felt her, and she wasn't done with me yet. Around midnight, I finally collapsed into bed, exhausted. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every time I drifted off, I jolted awake again, certain I had heard something. A creak, a whisper, breathing. Hours passed. But just when I was starting to believe maybe I was overreacting, I heard it. The front door creaking open. Furniture scraping across the floor. A soft, wet shuffle of bare feet on hardwood. Closer, closer. I froze under the covers, barely daring to breathe. Footsteps moved through the living room, into the kitchen, down the hall. They stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Silence. Then slowly, the first step. Another step. She was coming. I grabbed the baseball bat I had shoved under my bed earlier and crept to the door. I didn't know what my plan was. Fight her? All I knew was I couldn't just lie there and wait. The doorknob jiggled once, twice, then turned. Slowly, I braced myself. The door swung open a few inches, and I saw her, the younger woman, the deranged one, standing in the hallway. Her hair hung in greasy strands around her face. Her eyes, wild, unfocused, darted around the room, then locked onto me. She was barefoot, wearing a torn nightgown stained with dirt and something darker. And in her hand, a kitchen knife. Gripped so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled, a slow, broken thing that twisted her face into something inhuman. And she lunged. I swung the bat instinctively. It connected with her forearm, sending the knife clattering to the floor. She shrieked, a high, animalistic sound, and stumbled back. But she didn't stay down. She came at me again, hands clawing, eyes burning with madness. I shoved her hard. She slammed against the wall, knocking a framed picture to the floor with a crash. I didn't wait. I ran. Down the stairs. Across the living room. Toward the front door. I threw aside the sofa, yanked open the door, and froze. The older woman was standing on my porch. The caretaker. The one I thought was the sane one. But there was nothing sane about the way she looked at me. Cold. Hate-filled. Like I was nothing more than a bug she was about to crush. Behind me, I heard the younger woman shrieking again, stumbling after me. I was trapped. Without thinking, I barreled into the older woman, knocking her off balance. She screamed in rage as I sprinted down the street, barefoot, not daring to look back. I ran straight to the neighbor's house, the family with the loud music. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. It swung open, revealing a bleary-eyed man clutching a baseball bat of his own. Behind me, the two women were standing in the street, watching. Silent. Still. The police arrived minutes later. I told them everything. About the break-in, the knife, the attack. They searched my house, found the muddy footprints, the broken furniture, the knife lying in the hallway. But no sign of forced entry. No clear evidence of how she had gotten inside. The two women were questioned, of course. But the older one just shook her head, stone-faced. The younger one whimpered and rocked back and forth, refusing to speak. Without hard evidence, the police couldn't arrest them. They couldn't even press charges. But they gave me advice. Move, One officer said grimly, "Move as soon as you can." And I did. I broke my lease, packed everything I owned into my tiny car, and left that cursed house behind without looking back. I thought that would be the end of it, but sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I swear I hear it again. The soft creak of footsteps on the stairs, the jingle of a doorknob turning, the wet slap of bare feet on hardwood. And I remember, some prisons don't have bars. Some monsters don't hide in the dark. They live right next door.